What if I told you that sometimes the worst day of your life leads you to discover something extraordinary that changes everything? This is exactly what happened to 17-year-old Charlotte Pemberton on a cold November morning that would forever alter the course of her destiny. The leather seats of the black Bentley felt ice-cold against Charlotte's trembling hands as she pressed her face against the tinted window, watching the English countryside blur past in shades of gray and brown. The rhythmic hum of the engine should have been soothing, but instead, it seemed to echo the hollow ache in her chest that had been there for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks since the phone call that shattered her world. 3 weeks since the words, "I'm sorry, Miss Pemberton, but James didn't make it," had turned her life upside down. She closed her eyes, but the memories came flooding back anyway, as vivid and painful as if they were happening all over again. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, the sickening crunch of metal against metal, the deafening silence that followed, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the wreckage of James's silver Aston Martin on the M4 motorway. Her older brother, her best friend, her protector, gone in an instant because some drunk driver had decided to text while driving. The funeral had been a blur of black clothes, whispered condolences, and her parents' hollow-eyed grief. Lord and Lady Pemberton had barely spoken to each other since that day, let alone to Charlotte. They moved through their London townhouse like ghosts, and Charlotte felt like she was suffocating in the weight of their collective sorrow. That's when her mother had made the decision that felt like another betrayal. "You need time away from all this, darling. Your grandfather's estate will be good for you." Charlotte had wanted to scream that she didn't want to be good. She wanted to rage and cry and break things until the world felt as broken as she did inside. But instead, she'd packed her bags in silence and climbed into this car that was now carrying her away from everything familiar. The Bentley turned off the main road onto a narrow lane bordered by ancient stone walls covered in ivy. Charlotte's heart began to race as she recognized the landscape from childhood visits, the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, dotted with sheep and crisscrossed by hedgerows that had stood for centuries. But those visits had always been with James, and now the beauty of the countryside felt like a mockery of her grief. As they rounded a bend, Pemberton Estate came into view, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The manor house rose from the landscape like something from a Gothic novel, its honey-colored Cotswold stone walls glowing in the weak afternoon sunlight. But even from a distance, she could see the signs of neglect: missing roof tiles, overgrown gardens, and paint peeling from the window frames. It looked as tired and worn as she felt. The car crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, and Charlotte's driver, a silent man named Peters who had worked for her family for as long as she could remember, came around to open her door. The November air hit her like a slap, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something else, something wild and earthy that she couldn't quite identify. "Miss Charlotte," Peters said softly, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your grandfather is expecting you." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped out onto the gravel. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the countryside. She was about to head toward the imposing front door when a sound stopped her cold. A wild, haunting whinny that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the estate grounds. Without thinking, Charlotte turned toward the sound, her feet carrying her away from the house and toward a cluster of stone buildings that she remembered from childhood as the stables. The sound came again, closer now, and Charlotte felt something stir in her chest. Not the crushing weight of grief, but something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. She rounded the corner of the largest stable building and stopped dead in her tracks. There, in a paddock surrounded by weathered wooden fencing, stood the most magnificent horse she had ever seen. The animal was pure black, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the fading light. Every line of its body spoke of power and grace, from its arched neck to its delicate legs. But as Charlotte moved closer, she noticed something that made her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. The horse's left eye was clouded over, milky white against the darkness of its face. The beautiful creature was partially blind, and there was something in its stance, a wariness, a loneliness, that Charlotte recognized all too well. The horse noticed her approach and lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the fence, the grieving girl and the wounded horse, and Charlotte felt a strange sense of kinship with this magnificent, damaged creature. "You're hurt too, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the bare branches of the oak trees that surrounded the paddock. The horse took a step closer to the fence, and Charlotte could see intelligence in its good eye, along with something that looked almost like recognition. As if this beautiful, broken animal understood her pain in a way that no human had been able to. Charlotte reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing the horse's velvety muzzle before it pulled back. Not in fear, but in careful assessment. There was dignity in the gesture, and Charlotte found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. She didn't know it then, standing in the gathering dusk of a Cotswold evening with tears freezing on her cheeks. But her fate and that of this extraordinary horse were about to become intertwined in the most unexpected and life-changing way. The journey ahead would test every ounce of courage she possessed and teach her that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the deepest pain. But that's a story for the next part of our tale. The morning mist was still clinging to the Cotswold hills when Charlotte woke to the sound of expensive car engines purring up the gravel drive. She pressed her face against the diamond-paned window of her childhood bedroom and felt her stomach drop. Two vehicles had arrived simultaneously, a gleaming silver Range Rover that screamed money and privilege, and her grandfather's battered Land Rover returning from what she assumed was an early morning ride around the estate. Charlotte quickly threw on her riding boots and a thick wool sweater, her heart racing with an inexplicable sense of urgency. Something about the timing of these arrivals felt orchestrated, deliberate, and deeply threatening to the fragile peace she'd begun to find with Shadowmere over the past few days. She hurried down the grand staircase, its oak banister worn smooth by generations of Pemberton hands, and paused outside the drawing-room door. Voices drifted through the heavy wood, her grandfather's gruff baritone and another voice, female, cultured, and sickeningly sweet. "Lord Edmund, you must understand that my family's offer is more than generous," the woman was saying. £50,000 for a horse with such limitations is really quite extraordinary." Charlotte's blood turned to ice. They were talking about Shadowmere. Without hesitation, she pushed open the door and stepped into the room, her entrance causing both occupants to turn in surprise. Her grandfather stood by the massive stone fireplace, looking older and more worn than she remembered. His weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. But today, those lines seemed etched with worry and defeat. Across from him, perched elegantly on the edge of an antique sofa, sat the most perfectly polished woman Charlotte had ever seen. Victoria Ashworth was probably in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in an immaculate chignon, and wearing what Charlotte recognized as a bespoke Savile Row riding jacket that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her smile was practiced and predatory, like a shark that had scented blood in the water. "Ah, you must be Charlotte," Victoria said, rising gracefully and extending a manicured hand. "I've heard so much about you, darling. I'm Victoria Ashworth. I was just discussing with your grandfather the possibility of purchasing that magnificent black horse of yours." Charlotte ignored the offered hand, her eyes flashing with anger. "Shadowmere isn't for sale." Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her pale blue eyes. "Oh, but I'm afraid that's not entirely up to you, is it, dear? Business decisions are rather complex things." Lord Edmund cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Charlotte, perhaps you should let the adults discuss this matter." "No." Charlotte's voice was stronger than she felt. "James always said Shadowmere was the soul of this estate. How can you even consider selling her?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "I understand this must be difficult, losing your brother so tragically. But surely you can see that keeping a damaged horse is rather impractical? My family has the resources to provide proper care, and frankly, Lord Edmund, the estate's financial situation is quite precarious, isn't it?" The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. "What do you mean, financial situation?" Her grandfather's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Charlotte saw him not as the imposing patriarch she remembered from childhood, but as an old man carrying an impossible burden. The medical bills from James's accident, the funeral costs, the inheritance taxes. "Charlotte, we're drowning in debt. The bank is threatening foreclosure." Victoria's smile became even more predatory. "Which is why my offer is so timely. £50,000 would certainly help with the immediate crisis, wouldn't it? And of course, my family would be interested in discussing the purchase of the entire estate once the bank proceedings begin." Charlotte felt the room spinning around her. This woman wasn't just trying to buy Shadowmere. She was circling like a vulture, waiting to pick apart everything the Pemberton family had built over generations. The calculated cruelty of it, coming so soon after James's death, made her feel physically sick. "You're enjoying this," Charlotte said quietly, her voice trembling with rage. "You're actually enjoying watching our family fall apart." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "I'm a businesswoman, dear. Sentiment doesn't pay bills or save estates. Your grandfather understands that, even if you don't." "James would never have let this happen," Charlotte said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "He would have found another way. He would have fought for Shadowmere, for this place, for everything our family stands for." "But James isn't here, is he?" Victoria's voice was soft but brutal. "And wishes don't change reality." The cruelty of those words broke something inside Charlotte. Without another word, she turned and ran from the room, ignoring her grandfather's calls behind her. She burst through the front door and ran across the frost-covered grass toward the stables, her breath coming in sharp puffs in the cold morning air. She found Shadowmere in her paddock, standing motionless in the pale sunlight. The horse's head turned as Charlotte approached, and those intelligent dark eyes seemed to read the distress written across her face. Charlotte climbed over the fence, not caring about proper protocol or safety, and walked directly to the magnificent animal. "They want to take you away," she whispered, pressing her face against Shadowmere's warm neck. "That horrible woman wants to buy you like you're just some object, some trophy for her collection." Shadowmere stood perfectly still, allowing Charlotte to wrap her arms around the horse's powerful neck. For the first time since Charlotte had discovered her, the horse didn't pull away or maintain her careful distance. Instead, She lowered her great head and rested it gently against Charlotte's shoulder, as if offering comfort. In that moment, Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. The crushing weight of grief was still there, but alongside it was something new. A fierce, protective love for this wounded creature who understood her pain. They were both damaged, both grieving, both facing the threat of losing everything that mattered to them. "I won't let her take you," Charlotte whispered fiercely. "I don't know how, but I'll find a way. James would have found a way, and so will I." As if responding to her words, Shadowmere lifted her head and looked directly into Charlotte's eyes with her one good eye. In that gaze, Charlotte saw not just intelligence and pain, but something else. A spark of the fighting spirit that had once made this horse a champion. Standing there in the morning mist, with her arms around the neck of a horse who had become her kindred spirit in grief, Charlotte made a silent vow. Victoria Ashworth might think she held all the cards, but she had underestimated the bond between a broken-hearted girl and a wounded champion. Their fight was just beginning. The morning sun was filtering through the dusty windows of the estate's trophy room when Charlotte found herself face to face with the ghosts of Pemberton glory. She had been wandering the manor house aimlessly, trying to escape the suffocating weight of Victoria Ashworth's ultimatum, when she stumbled upon this forgotten shrine to the family's equestrian legacy. The walls were lined with gleaming silver cups, faded photographs, and red, white, and blue ribbons that told the story of generations of Pemberton champions. But it was the centerpiece that stopped Charlotte dead in her tracks. A massive oil painting of a magnificent black horse mid-leap over a towering fence, with a young man in traditional hunt colors seated perfectly in the saddle. "That's Shadowmere," came a gruff voice from behind her. Charlotte spun around to find Thomas Hartwell standing in the doorway, his weathered hands clutching a steaming mug of tea. The estate's head groom was a man of few words, but his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had spent 40 years working with horses. "And that's your brother James, 3 years ago at the Royal Windsor Horse Show," Thomas continued, stepping into the room with the careful gait of a man whose joints had been battered by decades of physical labor. "Greatest partnership I ever had the privilege to witness." Charlotte moved closer to the painting, her heart clenching as she took in every detail of James's face. The concentration, the joy, the absolute trust between horse and rider. "I remember that day," she whispered. "James was so nervous he threw up twice before the competition." Thomas chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. "Aye, but once he got on Shadowmere's back, all that nervousness disappeared. She had that effect on him, made him fearless." He paused, studying Charlotte's face. "You have his eyes, you know. Same fire burning underneath." "Tell me about her," Charlotte said suddenly, turning to face the old groom. "Tell me about Shadowmere before everything went wrong." Thomas settled into a worn leather armchair that had probably been in the room for 50 years, his eyes taking on a distant look. "Shadowmere came to us as a 3-year-old, already showing promise but wild as a March hare. Your grandfather bought her from a breeder in Ireland who said she was untrainable, too spirited, too proud. But James saw something in her that nobody else could see." Charlotte found herself sinking into the chair across from Thomas, hungry for every detail. "What did he see?" "Heart," Thomas said simply. "Pure, unbreakable heart. Most horses, when they're pushed to their limits, they'll give you what they can, and then they're done. But Shadowmere, she'd give you everything she had, and then somehow find more." James spent 2 years earning her trust, learning her language, becoming her partner instead of just her rider. The old groom stood and walked to a glass case containing a collection of photographs. He pulled out a framed picture and handed it to Charlotte. It showed James, probably 15 years old, sitting in the grass next to Shadowmere, both of them covered in mud but grinning widely. That was taken after their first real fall together, Thomas explained. James was attempting a jump that was too high for his skill level at the time. Shadowmere knew it, tried to refuse, but James insisted. They went down hard, both of them. I thought for sure the partnership was over. Most young riders would have lost their nerve. But not James, Charlotte said, tracing her finger over her brother's muddy face in the photograph. Not James, Thomas confirmed. He got up, checked Shadowmere for injuries, and then spent the next hour just sitting with her in that field, talking to her like she was a person. From that day forward, they were inseparable. She'd follow him around the estate like a dog, and he'd spend every free moment in her stall, reading to her, sharing his problems, his dreams. Charlotte felt tears starting to form in her eyes. What kind of things did he read to her? Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Poetry, mostly. Shakespeare, Wordsworth, sometimes just the racing forms from the newspaper. Didn't matter what it was, she'd stand there listening like she understood every word. Your brother believed horses were far more intelligent than most people gave them credit for. He was right, Charlotte said softly, remembering her own recent interactions with Shadowmere. She understands pain. She understands loss. Thomas nodded gravely. Aye, that she does. The accident that took her eye happened just 2 weeks after James died. She was training with a different rider. Your grandfather thought it might help her move on. But during the competition, something spooked her. Maybe it was the crowd noise. Maybe it was the unfamiliar hands on the reins. She misjudged a jump, caught her head on the top rail. The splinters. He trailed off, but Charlotte could imagine the rest. She blamed herself, didn't she? For James not being there to guide her. Animals grieve differently than humans, Thomas said carefully. But yes, I believe she felt responsible. She's barely allowed anyone near her since then, let alone on her back, until you came along. Charlotte looked up sharply. What do you mean? I've been watching you with her these past few days, Thomas said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been hope. She lets you touch her, lets you brush her coat, follows you around that paddock like she used to follow James. That's not coincidence, miss. That's recognition. Recognition of what? Of kindred spirit, Thomas said simply. You're both carrying the same wound, the same loss. But more than that, you both have the same fire that James had. The same refusal to give up when things get difficult. Charlotte stood and walked back to the oil painting, studying the perfect harmony between horse and rider captured forever in oils and varnish. Do you think James would want me to try to save her? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when Charlotte turned around, she saw him wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Miss Charlotte, I think your brother would be proud beyond words to see you standing here, asking that question. He always said Shadowmere wasn't just a horse. She was the soul of this estate, the living embodiment of everything the Pemberton family stood for. Courage, Charlotte whispered. Courage, Thomas agreed. And loyalty, and the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. James used to say that as long as Shadowmere was here, a piece of him would always be here too. Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest, a strengthening of the resolve that had been building since her confrontation with Victoria Ashworth. Thomas, will you teach me to ride her? Really ride her the way James did. The old groom studied her face for a long moment, and Charlotte could see him weighing the risks, the possibilities, the sheer audacity of what she was asking. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Shadowmere's been through trauma, and she's not the same horse she was before the accident. And you, well, you've got natural instincts, but you've never competed at this level." "I don't care how hard it is," Charlotte said fiercely. "Victoria Ashworth thinks she can waltz in here and buy our family's legacy like it's just another business transaction. She thinks Shadowmere is just damaged goods, worthless because she's not perfect anymore. But she's wrong." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived at the estate, she saw real hope in his eyes. "When do we start?" "Now," Charlotte said, looking one last time at the painting of James and Shadowmere in their moment of triumph. "We start right now." The first rays of dawn were painting the Cotswold hills in shades of gold and amber when Charlotte made her way to the stables, a worn, leather-bound book of poetry tucked under her arm. It had been James's favorite collection, Wordsworth and Keats, with pages yellowed from years of reading and rereading. She had found it on his nightstand the day after the funeral, and now she carried it everywhere like a talisman. Thomas was already there, of course, mucking out the stalls with the methodical precision of a man who had been doing this work for 4 decades. He looked up as Charlotte approached, noting the book in her hands and the determined set of her jaw. "Early start today, miss," he observed, leaning on his pitchfork. "Shadowmere's been restless all night, almost like she knew you were coming." Charlotte peered into Shadowmere's stall and found the magnificent horse standing alert, her one good eye fixed on the stable entrance. The moment she saw Charlotte, Shadowmere's ears pricked forward, and she took a step toward the stall door, a gesture that would have seemed insignificant to most people, but Thomas and Charlotte both recognized it as progress. "She's learning to trust again," Thomas said quietly. "But it's going to take time, patience, and more courage than most people possess. Are you sure you're ready for this, miss?" Charlotte nodded, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "James used to read to her, didn't he? You mentioned that yesterday." "Aye, he did. Every evening after training, he'd sit right there on that hay bale and read aloud while she ate her dinner. Said it calmed her nerves and helped her process the day's lessons." Thomas's weathered face softened with the memory. She'd stand there listening like she understood every word. Maybe she did. Charlotte opened the stall door slowly, moving with the deliberate care that Thomas had taught her over the past few days. Shadowmere watched her approach, but didn't retreat, which was more progress than they'd seen since Charlotte's arrival. The horse's nostrils flared slightly as she caught the familiar scent of the old book. "Hello, beautiful girl," Charlotte whispered, settling onto the hay bale that James had used as his reading chair. "I brought something I thought you might recognize." She opened the book to a page marked with a faded ribbon, one of James's favorites, she remembered. As she began to read Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, her voice soft but clear in the quiet stable, something magical happened. Shadowmere's entire posture changed, her head lowering as she moved closer to Charlotte, drawn by the familiar ritual that had once been such an important part of her daily routine. "These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye," Charlotte read, and she felt the irony of the words wash over her. Here was Shadowmere, partially blind herself, finding comfort in the same verses that had once soothed her in James's voice. Thomas watched from the stable doorway, hardly daring to breathe as Shadowmere took another step closer to Charlotte. The horse's damaged eye was turned away, but her good eye remained fixed on the girl with an intensity that spoke of recognition, of memory, of something deeper than simple animal instinct. "She remembers," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Charlotte. "After all this time, she remembers." Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself. Charlotte would arrive at dawn, spend an hour reading to Shadowmere while the horse ate her breakfast, then begin the slow, careful process of physical interaction that Thomas supervised with the keen eye of a master horseman. They started with simple grooming, brushing Shadowmere's coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian, cleaning her hooves, combing out her mane with gentle, patient strokes. "The key," Thomas explained as he watched Charlotte work, "is to let her set the pace. She's been hurt, betrayed by circumstances beyond her control. Trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild. But if you're consistent, if you're patient, if you show her every day that you're not going anywhere, she'll begin to believe in you." Charlotte found herself thinking about those words long after she left the stables each evening. Trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild. Wasn't that exactly what she was struggling with herself? The trust that the world was a safe place, that the people you loved wouldn't be ripped away from you without warning, that tomorrow would come and bring with it the possibility of happiness, rather than just more loss. By the end of the first week, Shadowmere was allowing Charlotte to lead her around the paddock on a long rope, her movements careful but willing. The horse's gait was slightly uneven, a reminder of the accident that had cost her the sight in one eye. But there was still grace in every step, still the echo of the champion she had once been. "She's testing you," Thomas observed one afternoon, as they watched Shadowmere navigate around a series of ground poles that he had set up in the paddock. "Seeing if you'll lose patience when she moves slowly, if you'll push her harder, then she's ready to go. James went through the same thing when she was young." "What did he do?" Charlotte asked, watching as Shadowmere carefully stepped over each pole, taking her time to judge the distance with her limited vision. "He waited," Thomas said simply. "He let her know that he had all the time in the world, that there was no rush, no pressure, no expectation, except that she do her best. That's when she started to bloom, when she realized that James wasn't going to abandon her if she wasn't perfect." That evening, Charlotte sat in Shadowmere's stall reading from a different book, a collection of short stories that James had loved. As she read, she found herself talking to Shadowmere between stories, sharing memories of her brother, her fears about the future, her anger at the unfairness of losing someone so young and full of life. "He was supposed to teach me to drive this summer," she found herself saying, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We had this whole plan. He was going to take me out on the back roads around the estate, let me practice in his car. He said I was too cautious, that I needed to learn to trust my instincts more." Shadowmere had moved closer during this confession, and now she stood with her great head lowered near Charlotte's shoulder, her warm breath stirring the girl's hair. It was the closest they had been since that first day, and Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest. Not the crushing weight of grief, but something lighter, warmer. "You understand, don't you?" Charlotte whispered, reaching up to stroke Shadowmere's velvety muzzle. "You know what it's like to lose someone who believed in you, who made you feel brave and strong and capable of anything." For the first time since the accident, Shadowmere allowed Charlotte to rest her forehead against the horse's neck, and they stood there together in the gathering dusk. two wounded souls finding comfort in their shared understanding of loss and the slow, difficult process of learning to hope again. Thomas, watching from the stable doorway, felt his eyes fill with tears. In 40 years of working with horses, he had never seen anything quite like this. The way these two broken spirits were healing each other, building something new from the ashes of their shared grief. James would be proud, he whispered to himself. And somehow, in the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the stable windows, he could almost feel the young man's presence, watching over the girl and the horse who had meant everything to him. The foundation of trust was being laid, one gentle moment at a time, and Thomas knew that what they were building together would be strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning of their first serious training session dawned gray and ominous, with heavy clouds gathering over the Cotswold hills like a warning of the storm to come. Charlotte had barely slept, her mind racing with doubts and fears about the impossible challenge she had set for herself and Shadowmere. 4 weeks to prepare for the Royal County Show. 4 weeks to transform a traumatized horse and an inexperienced rider into championship competitors. Thomas had set up a series of practice jumps in the main training arena, starting with modest 2-foot rails and building up to the intimidating 4-foot barriers that would be standard at the Royal County Show. As Charlotte led Shadowmere into the arena, she could feel the horse's tension radiating through the lead rope. Shadowmere's good eye was wide and alert, her nostrils flaring as she took in the sight of the jumps that so closely resembled the scene of her accident. "Easy, girl," Charlotte murmured, running her hand along Shadowmere's neck. "We'll take it slow, just like we practiced." But the moment Charlotte mounted and guided Shadowmere toward the first, smallest jump, everything went catastrophically wrong. The sight of the rails, the familiar setup of a jumping course, triggered something deep and primal in Shadowmere's traumatized psyche. The magnificent horse suddenly reared up on her hind legs, her front hooves pawing frantically at the air as a sound of pure terror escaped her throat. Charlotte, caught completely off guard, felt herself sliding backward in the saddle. She grabbed desperately for Shadowmere's mane, but the horse was beyond reason now, lost in the grip of a flashback so vivid that she was reliving every moment of the accident that had cost her an eye. Shadowmere spun violently to the left, and Charlotte lost her grip entirely, hitting the arena sand with a sickening thud that knocked the wind from her lungs. Thomas was beside her in seconds, his weathered hands checking for broken bones, while Shadowmere continued to pace frantically around the arena, her sides heaving with panic. "Miss Charlotte, are you hurt? Can you move your fingers? Your toes?" Charlotte struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her left shoulder. "I'm okay, I think. But Shadowmere..." She looked toward the horse, who had backed herself into a corner of the arena and was standing there trembling, her head held high in a posture of absolute terror. "She's having a panic attack," Thomas said grimly. "I should have seen this coming. The jumps, the arena setup, it's too much like that day. We pushed too hard, too fast." Before Charlotte could respond, the arena gate burst open and Lord Edmund strode in, his face thunderous with rage and fear. Behind him came 2 other figures that made Charlotte's heart sink. Victoria Ashworth, dressed in pristine riding attire and wearing an expression of smug satisfaction, and a man Charlotte didn't recognize carrying what looked like veterinary equipment. "That's enough!" Edmund shouted, his voice echoing off the arena walls. "I will not stand by and watch my granddaughter get killed by a dangerous, unstable animal." He turned to Victoria, his shoulders sagging with defeat. The deal is done. You can have her. Grandfather, no. Charlotte scrambled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing in her shoulder. It was just a setback. Shadowmere isn't dangerous. She's scared. Victoria stepped forward, her smile as cold as winter frost. I'm afraid your grandfather is being sensible, Charlotte. This little display has only confirmed what I've been saying all along. The horse is damaged goods, a liability. Dr. Morrison here will sedate her for transport to my facilities. Something in Victoria's tone, a note of barely concealed triumph, made Charlotte's blood run cold. You knew this would happen, she said slowly, the pieces falling into place. You knew that bringing her back to a jumping arena would trigger her trauma. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath. I know horses, dear, and I know that some wounds never truly heal. That's when Thomas spoke up, his voice quiet but filled with a fury that Charlotte had never heard before. Miss Charlotte, there's something you need to know. Something I discovered this morning. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small electronic device, a listening bug, no bigger than a button. I found this hidden in Shadowmere's feed bucket, Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on Victoria's suddenly pale face. And another one in the tack room. Someone's been monitoring our every conversation, our training schedule, our progress. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's composure cracked completely, her perfectly made-up face contorting with rage. You have no proof that device came from me. Anyone could have placed it there. But Charlotte was already moving, her mind racing as she remembered other small incidents over the past weeks. Equipment that had mysteriously malfunctioned, feed that had made Shadowmere unusually sluggish, the way Victoria always seemed to know exactly when to appear with her offers and ultimatums. It wasn't just the listening devices, was it? Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You've been sabotaging us from the beginning. The loose girth strap that nearly caused me to fall last week. The contaminated feed that made Shadowmere sick. The way you always seem to show up right after something goes wrong. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. You're being paranoid, child. Just because you're failing doesn't mean there's some grand conspiracy against you. But Thomas had moved to stand beside Charlotte, and his presence gave her courage. Show her the photographs, Thomas. The old groom reached into his other pocket and pulled out a series of printed photographs, images captured by the estate's security cameras that showed a figure in dark clothing moving around the stables at night, tampering with equipment, placing small objects in strategic locations. The cameras may be old, but they still work, Thomas said grimly. And they show someone who matches your height and build, Miss Ashworth, visiting our property on at least 6 occasions when you claimed to be in London. Victoria's face had gone white with fury, all pretense of civility abandoned. You think you're so clever, don't you? But it doesn't matter what you think you've discovered. The horse is still broken, the girl is still inexperienced, and this estate is still drowning in debt. I will have what I want, one way or another. The naked malice in her voice sent chills down Charlotte's spine, but it also ignited something fierce and protective in her chest. You're wrong about one thing, Victoria. Shadowmere isn't broken. She's healing. And so am I. Charlotte walked slowly toward Shadowmere, who was still pressed against the arena wall, her sides heaving with residual panic. But as Charlotte approached, speaking in the same soft, soothing voice she'd used during their reading sessions, something miraculous happened. Shadowmere's ears pricked forward, and she took a tentative step away from the wall. You see that? Charlotte said, not taking her eyes off the horse. She trusts me. Even after what just happened, even in the middle of her worst nightmare, she still trusts me. That's not something you can buy or steal or sabotage, Victoria. That's something real. As if to prove Charlotte's point, Shadowmere walked slowly across the arena and gently nuzzled Charlotte's injured shoulder, her touch as soft as a whisper. The gesture was so tender, so full of concern and affection, that even Lord Edmund's expression began to soften. Victoria, seeing her carefully laid plans crumbling around her, made one last desperate play. Fine. Keep your precious horse. But when you fail at the Royal County Show, and you will fail, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. And next time, I won't be nearly so generous with my offers. She turned on her heel and stalked out of the arena, her expensive boots clicking against the stone like gunshots. Dr. Morrison, looking deeply uncomfortable, packed up his sedation equipment and followed her without a word. In the silence that followed their departure, Charlotte stood with her arms around Shadowmere's neck, both of them trembling with the aftermath of crisis and revelation. They had survived Victoria's sabotage, exposed her treachery, and somehow grown even closer in the process. But the Royal County Show was still 3 weeks away, and Charlotte knew that their real test was yet to come. The morning of the Royal County Show dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming across the manicured grounds of the prestigious Equestrian Center. Charlotte stood at the edge of the competitors' area, her hands trembling as she watched the most elite riders in England warming up their magnificent horses. These were professionals who had been training since childhood, riding horses worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, backed by teams of experts and unlimited resources. And here she was, a 17-year-old girl with 3 weeks of intensive training, riding a partially blind horse that most people considered damaged goods. The absurdity of it should have been laughable, but Charlotte felt only a cold knot of determination in her stomach. "Miss Charlotte," Thomas said quietly, appearing at her elbow with Shadowmere's bridle in his weathered hands. "It's time." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. She had barely slept the night before, her mind cycling through every possible disaster scenario. What if Shadowmere panicked again at the sight of the jumps? What if Charlotte fell and embarrassed herself in front of thousands of spectators? What if Victoria Ashworth was right, and they were just fooling themselves about their chances? As they led Shadowmere toward the warm-up arena, Charlotte caught sight of Victoria across the competitors' area. The woman was dressed in pristine show attire, her platinum hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, standing beside a magnificent bay gelding that looked like he'd stepped out of an equestrian magazine. Victoria's rider was a young man with the kind of effortless confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and success. Victoria noticed Charlotte's approach and smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Charlotte, darling," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the space between them. "How brave of you to actually show up. I was half convinced you'd come to your senses and withdraw." Charlotte felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Ashworth," he said with icy politeness, "I trust you've been practicing your victory speech, though you might want to prepare a few backup options." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, Thomas, still living in the past, I see. This isn't a fairy tale, you know. Real competition requires real skill, not sentiment and wishful thinking." "We'll see about that," Charlotte said, finding her voice at last. She turned away from Victoria and focused on Shadowmere, running her hands along the horse's neck in the soothing gesture that had become second nature over the past weeks. The warm-up session was a nightmare of barely controlled chaos. Shadowmere was tense and skittish, her good eye rolling white at the sight of so many horses and riders moving around the practice jumps. Every time another horse thundered past, Shadowmere would shy sideways, her muscles coiled like springs ready to explode. "She's not ready for this," Charlotte whispered to Thomas, her confidence crumbling as she watched Victoria's horse clear a practice jump with mechanical precision. "Look at them. They're perfect. We don't belong here." Thomas caught Shadowmere's bridle and looked directly into Charlotte's eyes. "Miss Charlotte, do you remember what your brother used to say before every competition?" Charlotte shook her head, too overwhelmed to think clearly. He'd say, "It's not about being perfect, Thomas. It's about being brave enough to try." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. James never won because he was the most talented rider in the field. He won because he and Shadowmere trusted each other completely, and they were willing to risk everything for that trust. As if responding to James's name, Shadowmere's ears pricked forward, and she turned her head to look at Charlotte with her one good eye. In that dark gaze, Charlotte saw something that made her breath catch. Not fear or uncertainty, but recognition. Shadowmere was remembering too. Remembering the feeling of flying over jumps with James, the exhilaration of perfect partnership, the joy of doing what she was born to do. "For James," Charlotte whispered, and she could have sworn she felt her brother's presence beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice in her ear telling her she could do this. The announcement came over the loudspeaker. "Competitors for the advanced open jumping, please report to the arena entrance." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs as she led Shadowmere toward the arena. The stands were packed with spectators, their faces a blur of expectation and curiosity. She could hear the murmur of conversation, snippets of commentary about the young girl on the damaged horse, and speculation about how quickly they would be eliminated. Victoria's horse went before them, and Charlotte watched in sick fascination as the pair executed a flawless round. Every jump was perfect, every stride calculated, every movement a testament to years of professional training. The crowd applauded enthusiastically as Victoria's rider raised his hand in acknowledgement, and Charlotte saw Victoria's triumphant smile from the sidelines. "Competitor number 17, Charlotte Pemberton riding Shadowmere," the announcer's voice boomed across the arena. This was it. Charlotte mounted Shadowmere at the arena entrance, her hands shaking as she gathered the reins. The course stretched before them, 12 jumps ranging from 3.5 to 4.5 feet, with tight turns and technical combinations that would test every aspect of their partnership. As they entered the arena, the crowd fell silent. Charlotte could feel thousands of eyes on them, could sense the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that rippled through the stands. Shadowmere tensed beneath her, overwhelmed by the noise and spectacle, and for a terrifying moment, Charlotte thought the horse might bolt. Then, in the silence before the starting bell, Charlotte leaned forward and whispered the words that had become their ritual. "For James, beautiful girl. Let's show them what we're made of." The bell rang, and they were off. The first jump approached faster than Charlotte had expected, but Shadowmere gathered herself and sailed over it with room to spare. The second jump, a tricky combination, required a sharp turn that Shadowmere navigated with the grace of a dancer. With each successful obstacle, Charlotte felt her confidence growing, felt the familiar rhythm of their partnership taking hold. The crowd began to murmur with interest, then excitement, as it became clear that this wasn't going to be the disaster everyone had expected. Shadowmere was flying, her powerful hindquarters propelling them over jump after jump with increasing confidence. Her partial blindness, which everyone had seen as a liability, seemed to make her more focused, more attuned to Charlotte's guidance. They cleared the 8th jump, then the 9th, the crowd's excitement building with each success. Charlotte could hear Thomas shouting encouragement from the sidelines, could see her grandfather standing at the rail with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. But it was the 10th jump, a massive oxer that required perfect timing and absolute trust, that would make or break their round. As they approached, Charlotte felt Shadowmere hesitate for just a moment, the memory of her accident flickering through the horse's mind like a shadow. "I've got you," Charlotte whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Trust me, girl. We can do this together." Shadowmere's ears flicked back, listening to Charlotte's voice, and then forward again as she locked onto the jump. They took off in perfect synchronization, horse and rider moving as one, and for a moment they were flying, suspended in air and time, defying gravity and expectation and every voice that had told them they weren't good enough. They landed clean, and the crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the arena. 2 more jumps remained, but Charlotte knew in her heart that they had already won something far more valuable than any competition. They had proven that love and trust and determination could overcome any obstacle. As they approached the final jump, Charlotte felt James's presence so strongly, it was as if he were riding beside them, his spirit soaring with theirs as they cleared the last obstacle and crossed the finish line to thunderous applause. They had done it. Against all odds, against all expectations, they had completed a clear round at one of the most prestigious equestrian events in England. And as Charlotte dismounted and threw her arms around Shadowmere's neck, she knew that this was just the beginning of their incredible journey together. The thunderous applause that erupted from the packed grandstands of the Royal County Show seemed to shake the very earth beneath Shadowmere's hooves as Charlotte and her magnificent partner crossed the finish line with a perfect clear round. For a moment, Charlotte couldn't quite believe what had just happened. They had done it against all odds, against every expert prediction, against Victoria Ashworth's calculated sabotage and manipulation. As Charlotte dismounted, her legs trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, Shadowmere nuzzled her shoulder with the gentle affection that had become their signature gesture of trust and love. The crowd was on its feet, a sea of faces beaming with appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Not just a flawless jumping round, but a story of redemption, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a grieving girl and a wounded champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, barely audible over the continuing applause. With a clear round and a time of 58.4 seconds, Charlotte Pemberton and Shadowmere have just delivered one of the most remarkable performances in Royal County Show history. Thomas was the first to reach them, his weathered face streaming with tears of joy and pride as he threw his arms around both Charlotte and Shadowmere. "Miss Charlotte," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your brother would be so proud, so incredibly proud." But even as Charlotte basked in the glow of their unexpected triumph, she could see Victoria Ashworth across the competitor's area, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. The woman who had seemed so confident just hours earlier now looked like a predator whose carefully laid trap had spectacularly backfired. Victoria was speaking urgently into her phone, her free hand gesticulating wildly, and Charlotte felt a chill of apprehension despite their victory. Lord Edmund appeared at Charlotte's side, his eyes red with tears, but his face transformed by joy and relief. "My dear girl," he said, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I nearly made the biggest mistake of my life. Can you ever forgive a foolish old man?" Before Charlotte could respond, a commotion near the arena entrance caught everyone's attention. Two men in dark suits were approaching Victoria Ashworth, and even from a distance, Charlotte could see the woman's face go pale with shock and fear. One of the men was holding what appeared to be an official document, while the other carried a briefcase that looked suspiciously like evidence collection equipment. "Victoria Ashworth," the taller of the two men called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet competitors' area. "I'm Detective Inspector Morrison from the Gloucestershire Police. We need to speak with you regarding allegations of fraud, sabotage, and conspiracy to commit theft." The silence that followed was deafening. Every competitor, trainer, and spectator in the immediate area turned to stare as Victoria's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. Her platinum hair, which had been perfectly styled just moments before, was now disheveled from her frantic phone conversation, and her expensive riding jacket was wrinkled with perspiration. "This is ridiculous," Victoria sputtered, but her voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm a respected member of the equestrian community, not some common criminal." Detective Inspector Morrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. "Miss Ashworth, we have security footage from Pemberton Estate showing you trespassing on the property on multiple occasions. We also have recordings from the listening devices you planted in the stables, including several conversations where you discuss your plans to sabotage Miss Pemberton's training efforts." Charlotte felt her knees go weak with shock. Even though Thomas had discovered the listening devices, she hadn't fully grasped the extent of Victoria's criminal behavior. The woman hadn't just been trying to buy Shadowmere. She had been systematically destroying Charlotte's chances of success through illegal means. "Furthermore," the detective continued, his voice growing sterner, "we have evidence that you conspired with certain bank officials to accelerate the foreclosure proceedings on Pemberton Estate, with the intention of purchasing the property at a fraction of its true value. That constitutes fraud on multiple levels." Victoria's face had gone from pale to ashen gray. She looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route, but found herself surrounded by curious onlookers and the two determined police officers. "You can't prove any of this," she said weakly. But even she seemed to know that her protests were futile. The second officer, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up from his pad. "Miss Ashworth, we also have testimony from your former groom, Marcus Webb, who has provided detailed information about your instructions to tamper with Miss Pemberton's equipment and to introduce mild sedatives into Shadowmere's feed. Mr. Webb has agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Marcus Webb, she remembered him now, a quiet man who had worked briefly at Pemberton Estate just before her arrival. She had thought it was strange when he'd left so suddenly, but now she understood that he had been Victoria's inside man, planted to gather information and create opportunities for sabotage. "You drugged Shadowmere," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "You actually drugged her to make her sluggish during training. How could you do something so cruel to an innocent animal?" Victoria's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the ugly truth beneath her polished exterior. "That horse should have been put down after her accident," she snarled, all pretense of civility abandoned. "She's damaged goods, worthless, and you're just a naive little girl playing at being a rider. I was doing everyone a favor by removing you both from the equation." The cruelty of those words, spoken in front of hundreds of witnesses, seemed to galvanize the crowd. A murmur of disgust rippled through the spectators, and Charlotte could see several prominent members of the equestrian community shaking their heads in dismay. Victoria Ashworth had just destroyed her own reputation more thoroughly than any criminal conviction ever could. Detective Inspector Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs. "Victoria Ashworth, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, animal cruelty, and trespassing. You have the right to remain silent." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, her expensive heels clicking against the pavement for the last time as a free woman, Charlotte felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. The victory felt complete now, not just their success in the jumping competition, but the exposure of the truth that had been hidden for so long. Thomas appeared at her side, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the police car disappear into the distance. "Justice has a way of finding its mark, Miss Charlotte," he said quietly. "Your brother always believed that good would triumph over evil, given enough time and courage." Charlotte nodded, then turned to look at Shadowmere, who was standing calmly nearby, seemingly unaffected by all the drama. The magnificent horse's good eye was fixed on Charlotte with an expression that looked almost like satisfaction, as if she too understood that their tormentor had finally been brought to justice. "Come on, beautiful girl," Charlotte whispered, taking Shadowmere's lead rope. "Let's go home. We have a lot of celebrating to do, and a lot of healing to continue." As they walked toward the horse trailer that would carry them back to Pemberton Estate, Charlotte felt James's presence more strongly than ever. Her brother's spirit seemed to be walking beside them, proud and joyful and finally at peace, knowing that the family legacy he had loved so much was safe in Charlotte's capable hands. The sun was setting over the Cotswolds as they began their journey home, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise a bright and hopeful future for both the girl and the horse who had found healing in each other's wounded hearts. In the quiet aftermath of their triumph at the Royal County Show, as the crowds dispersed and the adrenaline slowly faded from their systems, Charlotte found herself sitting in Shadowmere's stall, her back against the warm stone wall, watching her magnificent partner methodically eat her evening hay. The events of the day felt almost surreal now. The thunderous applause, Victoria's dramatic arrest, the weight of the championship ribbon that now hung on the stable wall. But more than any external validation, what struck Charlotte most profoundly was the internal transformation that had taken place, not just in herself, but in the remarkable horse who had become her partner in healing. The psychology of their journey together revealed layers of complexity that went far beyond a simple story of girl meets horse. What Charlotte and Shadowmere had experienced was a textbook example of what trauma specialists call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where individuals don't just recover from devastating experiences, but actually emerge stronger, more resilient, and more deeply connected to their authentic selves than they were before the trauma occurred. Both Charlotte and Shadowmere had entered their relationship carrying the weight of profound loss. Charlotte with the sudden, violent death of her beloved brother James, and Shadowmere with the traumatic accident that had cost her an eye, and more significantly, her trust in the world around her. The healing process they had undergone together illustrated several key principles of trauma recovery that psychologists have identified as essential for genuine healing. First and most importantly was the establishment of safety, not just physical safety, but emotional and psychological safety as well. Charlotte had instinctively understood that Shadowmere needed to feel completely secure before any real progress could be made, and she had patiently created an environment where the horse could begin to trust again. This patience wasn't just kindness. It was a recognition of the fundamental truth that healing cannot be rushed or forced, but must unfold at its own natural pace. The second crucial element was the restoration of choice and control. Trauma, by its very nature, involves a complete loss of control. The victim becomes powerless in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Both Charlotte and Shadowmere had experienced this powerlessness in their respective traumas, and their healing journey had been fundamentally about reclaiming their agency. Charlotte had chosen to fight for Shadowmere rather than passively accepting Victoria's manipulation, while Shadowmere had gradually chosen to trust Charlotte, to allow herself to be vulnerable again, and ultimately to return to the jumping arena that had been the site of her trauma. The human-animal bond that developed between Charlotte and Shadowmere exemplified what researchers call mutual regulation, the process by which two beings help each other maintain emotional equilibrium. Horses are particularly gifted at this kind of emotional attunement because they are prey animals who have evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to the emotional states of those around them. Shadowmere could sense Charlotte's grief, her fear, her determination, and her growing confidence, and she responded to each emotional shift with her own behavioral changes. Similarly, Charlotte learned to read Shadowmere's body language, to understand when the horse was anxious or relaxed, fearful or confident, and to adjust her own energy accordingly. This process of mutual regulation had profound therapeutic benefits for both partners. For Charlotte, caring for Shadowmere provided what psychologists call meaning-making, the ability to find purpose and significance in the midst of loss. Her brother's death had initially felt senseless and cruel, but through her relationship with Shadowmere, Charlotte began to understand that James's love for this horse and his belief in the healing power of the human-animal bond could live on through her actions. She wasn't just saving a horse. She was honoring her brother's memory and carrying forward his values of compassion, courage, and loyalty. The social dynamics revealed in their story also provided important insights into class, privilege, and the nature of true nobility. Victoria Ashworth represented everything that was corrupt about inherited privilege. The belief that wealth and social position gave her the right to manipulate and exploit others for her own gain. Her treatment of both Charlotte and Shadowmere revealed a fundamental lack of empathy and moral character that no amount of money or breeding could disguise. In contrast, Charlotte's response to adversity demonstrated what the Victorian era called true gentility, nobility of character rather than nobility of birth. The story also illustrated the complex relationship between grief and growth. Charlotte's initial response to James's death had been to withdraw, to isolate herself from the world that had proven so unpredictably dangerous. But her connection with Shadowmere had gradually drawn her back into engagement with life, not by forgetting her grief, but by transforming it into something purposeful and healing. This transformation didn't diminish her love for James or minimize the reality of her loss. Instead, it allowed her to carry that love forward in a way that created meaning and hope. Perhaps most significantly, the story demonstrated the power of what trauma therapists call earned security, the ability to develop healthy attachment patterns even after experiencing profound loss or betrayal. Both Charlotte and Shadowmere had their basic trust in the world shattered by their respective traumas, but through their patient, consistent care for each other, they had rebuilt that trust on a foundation that was actually stronger than what they had possessed before. They had learned that love doesn't eliminate the possibility of loss, but that the capacity to love and be loved is what makes life worth living despite its inherent risks. The therapeutic riding program that Charlotte envisioned establishing at Pemberton Estate represented the natural evolution of their healing journey, the transformation from personal recovery to service to others. This progression from victim to survivor to thriver to helper is a common pattern in post-traumatic growth, where individuals who have successfully navigated their own healing journey feel called to help others who are struggling with similar challenges. As Charlotte sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the peaceful sounds of Shadowmere's breathing and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields, she understood that their story was far from over. They had won a competition and defeated a villain, but more importantly, they had discovered something profound about the nature of healing, love, and resilience. They had learned that broken things could be made beautiful again, that trust could be rebuilt even after betrayal, and that the deepest wounds could become sources of the greatest strength. Their journey together had proven that healing is not about returning to who you were before trauma struck, but about becoming someone new, someone who carries their scars with dignity, who has learned to transform pain into purpose, and who understands that the most profound connections often arise between wounded souls who choose to heal together. 6 months had passed since that triumphant day at the Royal County Show, and the transformation of Pemberton Estate was nothing short of miraculous. The morning sun streamed through the newly repaired windows of the manor house, casting golden light across freshly painted walls and carefully restored antique furniture. The grounds, once overgrown and neglected, now bloomed with vibrant gardens tended by a small but dedicated staff. The stables had been expanded and modernized, equipped with state-of-the-art facilities that would have made James proud. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the buildings or the landscaping. It was in the atmosphere of hope and healing that permeated every corner of the estate. Charlotte stood at the window of what had once been James's bedroom, now converted into an office for the Pemberton Therapeutic Riding Foundation, watching as a group of children worked with their assigned horses in the main arena below. Each child carried their own burden of loss. Some had lost parents in accidents. Others had survived traumatic experiences that had left invisible scars on their young hearts. At the center of it all was Shadowmere, now officially designated as the program's lead therapy horse. The magnificent black mare moved with patient grace among the children, her one good eye seeming to see straight into their souls, recognizing the pain they carried and offering the same gentle comfort she had once given to Charlotte. It was remarkable to watch how naturally Shadowmere had taken to this new role, as if she understood that her own journey through trauma and healing had prepared her for this greater purpose. "Miss Charlotte," came Thomas's familiar voice from the doorway. The old groom looked years younger these days, his weathered face bright with purpose and satisfaction. "The new group from London has arrived. 8 children this time, ages 7 to 14. Dr. Martinez says they're all dealing with various forms of grief and loss." Charlotte turned from the window, her heart swelling with the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with each new group of children. "How's Shadowmere doing with the increased workload? I worry sometimes that we're asking too much of her." Thomas chuckled, the sound warm and reassuring. "Miss, that horse has never been happier. Yesterday I caught her actually seeking out little Emma when the girl was having a particularly difficult session. Shadowmere walked right over and rested her head on Emma's shoulder until the crying stopped. It's like she's found her true calling." The therapeutic riding program had been Charlotte's idea, born from her own experience of healing through her bond with Shadowmere. Working with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a renowned equine-assisted therapy specialist, Charlotte had developed a comprehensive program that combined traditional riding instruction with psychological support and emotional healing. The results had been extraordinary. Children who had been withdrawn and unresponsive began to open up when working with the horses, finding in these gentle giants the non-judgmental companionship they needed to process their grief. The program's success had attracted attention from across England and beyond. Families traveled from as far as Scotland and Wales to participate in the intensive 2-week sessions, and there was already a waiting list stretching into the following year. More importantly, the program had provided Pemberton Estate with a sustainable source of income that honored the family's equestrian heritage while serving a vital community need. Charlotte made her way down to the stables, where she found Lord Edmund working alongside the children, his gruff exterior completely transformed in their presence. Her grandfather had become one of the program's most devoted volunteers, sharing stories of the estate's history and teaching the children about the noble tradition of horsemanship. The financial crisis that had once threatened to destroy everything had been resolved not just through the program's success, but through a generous grant from the Royal Foundation for Children's Welfare, which had recognized the innovative nature of their work. "Grandfather," Charlotte called out as she approached the group, "how are our new friends settling in?" Edmund looked up from where he was helping a shy 10-year-old boy named Marcus brush a gentle chestnut mare named Buttercup. "They're remarkable, Charlotte. This young man here lost his father in Afghanistan, and he hasn't spoken a word since arriving yesterday. But watch this." Edmund guided Marcus's hand as he continued brushing the horse's coat, and Charlotte could see the subtle relaxation in the boy's posture, the way his breathing had become deeper and more regular. "Horses don't judge, do they, Marcus?" Charlotte said softly, moving to stand beside the boy. "They don't care if you're sad or angry or scared. They just accept you exactly as you are." Marcus looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face, and for just a moment, Charlotte saw a flicker of recognition. The same look she had seen in Shadowmere's eye that first day, the acknowledgement of shared pain and the possibility of shared healing. As the afternoon session concluded, and the children were led back to the residential wing of the manor for dinner and evening activities, Charlotte found herself alone with Shadowmere in the mare's spacious stall. The horse had been fitted with a special halter that accommodated her partial blindness, and she moved with the confidence of an animal who had learned to trust her remaining senses and the humans who cared for her. "You know what you've become, don't you, beautiful girl?" Charlotte whispered, running her hands along Shadowmere's neck. "You're not just a therapy horse. You're a healer, a teacher, a living example of how broken things can be made beautiful again." Shadowmere turned her great head to nuzzle Charlotte's shoulder, the gesture as familiar and comforting as it had been that first day when two wounded souls had found each other in their darkest hour. But now there was something different in the horse's demeanor, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went beyond personal healing to encompass a broader mission of service to others. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Charlotte's attention, and she looked up to see Dr. Martinez walking toward them, her face bright with excitement. "Charlotte, I've just received the most wonderful news. The International Association for Equine-Assisted Therapy wants to feature our program in their annual conference. They're calling it a revolutionary approach to childhood grief counseling." Charlotte felt a surge of pride, not for herself, but for what they had all accomplished together. She and Shadowmere, Thomas and Lord Edmund, and all the children who had found healing within these ancient walls. "James would be so proud," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "He is proud," Dr. Martinez replied gently. "I believe that love like your brother's doesn't simply disappear when someone dies. It transforms into something larger, something that can touch many more lives than one person ever could alone." As the sun began to set over the Cotswold hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Charlotte of that first evening when she had discovered Shadowmere. She felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of an ending, but of a beginning. The start of a legacy that would honor James's memory, while creating new hope for countless children who needed to learn that healing was possible, that love could triumph over loss, and that sometimes the most beautiful things in life emerged from the deepest pain. Charlotte mounted Shadowmere bareback, as she had done so many times during their early days together, and they rode out across the estate's rolling fields. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of children's laughter from the manor house, and Charlotte felt James's presence as strongly as she ever had, not as a ghost haunting the past, but as a living force inspiring the future. "James taught me that true love never dies," Charlotte said aloud, her voice carrying across the peaceful countryside. "It just transforms into something different, into courage, into compassion, into the ability to heal other wounded souls. And that's exactly what we're going to keep doing, isn't it, Shadowmere? We're going to keep proving that broken things can be beautiful, that trust can be rebuilt, and that love really can conquer all." As they rode toward the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun, Charlotte knew that their story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. A story that would continue to unfold with each child they helped, each life they touched, each heart they helped to heal. The Pemberton legacy would live on, not in trophies or ribbons, but in the countless lives that would be transformed by the power of love, patience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and horses. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the healing power of love and the possibility of hope emerging from even the darkest circumstances, please share it with others who might need to hear this message. Because sometimes, the most important victories aren't won in competitions or contests, but in the quiet moments when broken hearts learn to trust again, and wounded souls discover that they are not alone in their journey toward healing.